Hi, the purpose of this lecture is to talk about security architecture, how organizations can use security architecture to get better results from their security programs. Here is a quick overview of table of contents, why organizations need security architecture, what is security architecture, few examples where things may have gone wrong, then talk about pillars of security architecture, which are capabilities, patterns, reference architecture. Then talk about architecture risk analysis process. Then talk about security architecture frameworks. So why organizations need security architecture program? If there is no security architecture program, it means organization is putting controls randomly. They may be using different tools for solving the same problem. They may be using different patterns for solving the same problem. Different lines of businesses may have different reference architectures. All this will lead to inconsistencies in the security architecture. If they have a formal security architecture program, they can standardize on their tool sets, they can build patterns and use them consistently, and they can build reference architectures and use them consistently. All this will lead to increase in security posture of the organization and reduces porous defenses. So what is security architecture? Architecting consistent set of security controls which will maintain confidentiality, integrity and availability and will reduce security risks. Here is a simple example. In this example, we are using web application firewall to protect a server. The web application firewall is acting as a control protecting the server from external threats. That way it is maintaining confidentiality, integrity and availability. This is a very simple example. In real life, the architecture is much more complex and we can use patterns and reference architectures to solve those complex architecture problems. Now let's talk few examples where things may have gone wrong. This is from 2017. I wanted my credit to be monitored. So I went to one of the credit monitoring services and I opened a account online. While opening the account, they wanted me to answer few security questions so I can reset my password at a later point of time. The questions are like, what is your mother's maiden name? What is the name of your first pet? Things like that. I answered those questions, opened the account, and after few months, I had to call the organization for some reason. When I called, the call went to a different country. Their call center agent is sitting in a different country. He wanted to authenticate me first, and he wanted me to authenticate by answering the same set of questions I answered while opening the account. This is a big red flag for me because I have used these same questions and answers on other websites, and this gentleman has access to my credit profile. It means he can use all this information and potentially reset passwords on other websites. So what went wrong in this example? It is possible the organization may not have a formal security architecture program. It is possible they may not have done good threat modeling. They may be having business pressures where they were forced to use authentication data collected on one channel for authenticating on another channel. They also seems to have cross-border data movement control issues. The last thing is they may not be hashing their passwords. The reason the agent can see the authentication data in clear text It makes me believe they are not hashing their authentication data. Another example, this is from 2019. It is the same credit monitoring service. This time I had to go to their website because I wanted to place a lock on my credit. When I went to their website, they wanted to authenticate me first. They wanted to authenticate me by answering few set of questions like which county I lived in, who is my formal employer, things like that. Then they asked me another question, what is birthday of a person you live with? I never lived with this person and this person used my address while relocating to a different location. I don't know the date of birth of this person and I failed my authentication. So what went wrong in this example? It seems the organization is using some sort of artificial intelligence to put these questions together and it didn't seem to be working very well. Also, the organization wanted me to know date of birth of a person who is not an immediate member of my family. It means probably they don't give consideration for privacy. I am not trying to pick on this particular organization, but there are a lot of other organizations which are having similar issues. One of the main reasons is the organization are not performing good threat modeling. Now let's move on to pillars of security architecture. The first pillar is capability. The capability represents a tool set or a skill set or a homegrown solution by the organization which will help put a control in place. Examples, ping identity for federation, Protegrity for tokenization, Guardium Improva for database monitoring. When you are working with capabilities, you need to work with your enterprise architecture teams, identify the capabilities required by the organization, then build a roadmap and implement those capabilities in the organization. Once you acquire a capability, you may have to make presentations to various stakeholders. What is this capability? What kind of risks this capability solves? And how to use this capability? If the stakeholders are not aware or if you don't get a buy-in from the stakeholders, they may not be using the capability in their projects. The next thing is if the capability is critical, then you may want to add it to your baseline checklist and enforce it at that level. The next thing is standardize on tool sets. If there are multiple tools solving the same problem, then you have a overlap. This will confuse teams. They don't know which tool to select or what to do. This also introduces cost problems to the organization. It also needs manpower to manage different tools. That's the reason we need to standardize on the tools. That way we can also achieve consistency across the organization. The next pillar is patterns. Pattern represents a solution for a repeating problem. Sometimes they're also called design patterns. Examples, end-to-end encryption, third-party data sharing pattern, etc. If you want to share some data securely between your web page and web server, you may want to consider end-to-end encryption. Whereas if you are trying to share data with a third party, you may consider mutual TLS. So once you identify the repeating problems, make a solution out of it, identify the right set of controls for the solution, that will become a pattern for you. And once you have the pattern in place, try enforcing the pattern that will lead to consistencies in the architecture. The next one is reference architecture. When you are working at the reference architecture level, the first thing is talk to your vendors. For example, if you are trying to implement a CASP, like a Palo Alto Aperture or MVision CASP, the vendors may already have a reference architecture they built looking at various customers they are having. So that provides a very good starting point for you. The next place you may want to look at is various industry standard reference architecture. For example, organizations like Cloud Security Alliance, they all have some sort of reference architectures. Instead of trying to build our own reference architecture, we can take that and customize it according to our capabilities and our patterns. If you cannot find anything, you may have to end up building it from the scratch. So you can have reference architecture for cloud, identity access management, mobile security, so on and so forth. I want to bring up a point here, which is difference between patterns and reference architecture, and which comes first. Reference architecture is representing a domain level architecture, like you have a cloud security architecture, you have a mobile security architecture, things like that. Whereas the pattern is representing a solution for a repeating problem. If you have a pattern built for encryption, you can use that pattern in your cloud security, in your mobile security, things like that. So the patterns are cutting horizontally, whereas the reference architectures are more vertical and domain specific. I hope that helps understanding the difference. So now let's talk about architecture risk analysis process. Before you come to architecture risk analysis process, you need to have a strong understanding of the capabilities of the organization. You need to have a good controls on the patterns and the reference architectures. So once you start your architecture risk analysis process, the first thing is look at the business requirements and understand what are the business risks. If you do not have an understanding of business risks, either you might end up putting excessive controls, which might cause problems for the business to perform, or you may end up putting less controls. That way, you are putting the business at risk. So, once you have an understanding of business requirement and business risks, the first thing is perform threat modeling. Threat modeling is heart of the security architecture process. My next slide going to cover little bit on threat modeling. But threat modeling itself is a very big topic. Probably I will try to do a lecture on it in a future point of time. So once you perform threat modeling, you will have an understanding what kind of threats and what kind of controls you may be needing. Sometimes the threat modeling may not capture all the controls you need. For example, if your system is in scope for PCI and it may need some kind of multi-factor authentication, you may not have captured this in your threat modeling. So after performing threat modeling, you may have to do further assessments relating to compliance, fraud, defense in depth. That way, you are going to cover all the aspects and all the controls required. So, the next step in this process is building misuse and abuse cases. These will help validating your controls at a later point of time when the system is ready to move into production. So once you are done with your threat modeling and your assessment, you are going to come up with a set of controls you are looking at. So now you look at your patterns which you already established and you look at your reference architectures and see if any of them is going to work as a baseline for you. So if you already have a reference architecture, or if you have a patterns which is going to help, take that pattern and all the controls you established in the pattern are going to work as a baseline set of controls. So once you have this baseline set of controls, you may need some controls which are specific to this solution. And just like I mentioned, multi-factor authentication. So build those controls. Once you are done with it, then you are done putting your controls. And once the system is ready, then you go ahead and perform security testing. While performing security testing, use your misuse abuse cases to validate your controls. You may also want to do some kind of VA testing. So once you are done with your testing, you may find some gaps in your architecture and you may find some issues from your VA testing or some other things you may have found. All this is going to constitute a gap in the architecture and it's going to be the residual risk. We are going to talk at a later point of time how do we manage this residual risk. The last thing is look at your patterns and reference architectures and see if they need any enhancements because of the things you found as part of this solution. So that way you can make a new pattern or enhance your existing patterns with new set of controls. As I mentioned, threat modeling is a heart of the security architecture. So use well-known modeling tools like Stride and Patsta. That way you can cover most possible threats. Build a library of possible threats which are specific to your organization. For example, if your organization is a large financial firm, they may be having special cases like advanced persistent threats, things like that. Also, build data flow diagrams and process flow diagrams. Most of the time, the data flow diagrams are enough for putting right set of controls. They indicates how the data is moving within the system, and when data is crossing the boundaries, you can have right set of controls. Sometimes the data flow diagrams are not enough themselves. You may need process flow diagrams. For example, password reset process. There, the data moving may not help you identify right set of controls or right set of process you need to have for resetting the passwords. In those cases, you may need to have kind of process flow diagrams which will help in these scenarios. So once you have all those diagrams, you identify what are all the assets you need to protect and what are all the threats the assets possibly going to face. Also identify various security zones, like if the data is sitting inside the organization, there could be potential threats from insider threats. Whereas if you are going to share the data with a third party, you may have a potential threats like they may be sharing the data with a fourth party, or themselves may not be having right set of controls to protect your data. Then identify all the threats. Once you identify the threats, you can come up with look at with your existing controls, and if needed come up with new controls. Then go back and continue your assessment processing from the point of threat modeling. So what kind of documents we produce out of our architecture risk analysis process? We are going to produce misuse abuse cases. These are going to help validate our controls. Then we are going to update our data flow diagrams with the controls we have identified. Sometimes we may have to update our patterns, build new patterns, or make updates to our reference architectures. We are going to build executive summary. As part of the executive summary, you need to identify all the threats you found, all the controls which are in place, all the residual risks for which there are no controls. Last thing is risk management process, where managing the gaps in the security architecture through the risk management process. So when we need to do reassessment of our security architecture, we need to reassess our security architecture whenever there is a change in the business risk appetite. The business may go through mergers, acquisition, divestitures, things like that. Or the business may decide to get onto new line of business. The next thing is change in data classification. Over the time, we might be adding new set of elements. We might be getting rid of some elements. We might be coming in scope for some compliances. All these will may lead to reassessment of our security architecture, because the change in data classification will result in changes in the controls. The last thing is, if there are any major changes in authentication authorization, you may want to reassess your architecture. So now let's talk a little bit about security architecture frameworks. The first thing we need to understand about security architecture is threat modeling. Threat modeling is the heart of the security architecture. If you don't have people who can perform good threat modeling, the security architecture framework is not going to help your organization. Also understand the security architecture framework needs lot of bandwidth and an effort. So if your organization is small or medium, you are going to do very well having a consistent set of capabilities and consistent set of patterns. If required, follow industry's standard reference architectures. Whereas if you are a big large organization with various lines of businesses, the security architecture frameworks will help you. Also understand the security architecture itself has its own frameworks like NIST, OSI, and things like that. They also have industry leading benchmarks um, like CSA benchmarks, things like that. So Before you start on your security architecture framework, look at the capacity of your organization, look at the needs of the organization, look at the security frameworks the organization is using, then proceed from there. I have listed here a diagram which I copied from this link. In this link, the author is trying to compare various security architecture frameworks out there, and he also identified which framework helps the best in which scenario. As I mentioned, threat modeling is the most important thing in security architecture. Also, the author tells the same thing. OSA is the best while you use it. The reason OSA has best threat modeling. The next thing is, if the next link I provided is if the organization really need a security architecture framework or not. The third one is one of the leading security architecture frameworks. So now let's talk a little bit what is not a security architecture. System accreditation. When you are performing architecture risk analysis, the security architect needs to identify the threats. He needs to identify controls which are going to compensate the threats. He shouldn't be making a decision on the system accreditation. In the executive summary, he just needs to list what and all he found, and the executive management will make a decision on go no go. The next thing is security testing. As a security architect, you put some controls in place. You have a point of view, and your controls are based on that point of view. And if you are going to perform security testing, it may not help identify any gaps you left out. So the architect should never be performing the testing. If a third person performs the testing, they can look at a different aspect, those controls, and they may find some gaps. The next thing is annual risk assessment. The security architecture teams should not be part of the annual risk assessments. Same thing with the auditing and monitoring. As a security architect, you need to build controls for auditing and monitoring. You shouldn't be performing the tasks of auditing and monitoring. So here I provided a set of links which might be helpful with your security architecture program. The first thing is Safe Code Threat Modeling White Paper. This is a very good white paper. Everybody should go through it. The next one is from Microsoft on the threat modeling. The next one helps you to identify how to build abuse misuse cases. The next one is SAPSA links. This is the links where I mentioned about security architecture framework, if we really need one or not. And the next one is where the author has compared various security architecture frameworks. So get in touch with me if you have any suggestions, um, comments, or anything. Get in touch with me. In my next lecture, I am planning to present on managing the security architecture gaps through risk management processes. The last thing I want to mention is this lecture has nothing to do with the organization I work for. Thank you. Thanks for listening.